Welcome to This Explainer. Have you ever had a truly toxic boss? Well, let's dive into this. When we think of Alexander the Great, we almost automatically picture brilliant battlefield tactics, unstoppable phalanges, and a completely legendary march across the known world. But what if I told you that the real story of his conquests and the spectacular collapse of his empire was actually driven by something way more relatable? Today, we're exploring a pretty radical idea. We're going to see how Alexander's legendary campaigns were shaped and ultimately doomed by some of the most cutthroat, toxic workplace dynamics in human history. It's a fascinating question, isn't it? How exactly did toxic office politics bring down the greatest empire in the ancient world? Throughout this explainer, we're going to analyze ancient history through the very modern lens of corporate restructuring, departmental rivalries, and violent power struggles. Because, behind the spears and the shields, Alexander's high command was basically a boardroom completely tearing itself apart. So let's start with the architecture of conquest and the inherited friction. Imagine taking over a massive operation at age 20. Alexander didn't get to pick his own executive team. He inherited a seasoned military establishment completely dominated by his father's old general, Parmenion. And Parmenion, he didn't view Alexander as a living god. To him, Alexander was just a junior partner, the first among equals. You can see how quickly their two contrasting philosophies clashed. Parmenion represented the old guard. He wanted cautious engagements, secure supply chains, and super pragmatic tactics like night attacks. Alexander, on the other hand, was all about psychological momentum. He demanded daylight assaults, head-on charges, and the absolute total subjugation of his enemies. At major battles like Granicus and Gaugamela, Parmenion literally begged for caution, but Alexander completely ignored him, totally determined to establish absolute psychological dominance. And honestly, nothing brilliantly illustrates just how unbridgeable the rift in their worldviews truly was, like this one exchange. After the Battle of Issus, the Persian king Darius offered massive concessions in peace terms. Parmenion, the pragmatic veteran, famously said, "I would accept if I were Alexander." Alexander's response? "So should I if I were Parmenion." It's basically the ultimate ancient boardroom burn. It proved they were no longer fighting the same war at all. Parmenion wanted a profitable victory. Alexander wanted the entire world. That brings us to purging the old guard, which was a violently aggressive restructuring. As Alexander's ambitions shifted from simply defeating Persia to actually ruling it, he realized he had a massive human resources problem. The old generals were holding him back. To achieve his vision, he needed to initiate a deadly corporate restructuring to break the old guard's monopoly on power. And it truly was a monopoly. The military power wasn't just held by older generals generally, it was incredibly concentrated within one single family. Parmenion was second in command. His son Philotas commanded the elite Companion Cavalry, which was the army's primary strike force. Another son, Nicanor, commanded the Hypaspists, the elite infantry. Alexander didn't really have subordinates, he had a rival faction. Every strategic decision felt like a tense negotiation rather than a direct order. So when an opportunity arose, Alexander took swift, absolutely ruthless action in a deadly domino effect. In late 330 BCE, in what became known as the Philopathus affair, Philopathus was accused of failing to report a treasonous plot. Alexander seized the moment right then and there. By October, Philopathus was tried, tortured, and executed. But Alexander knew you can't fire the son and just leave the father around. So that same winter, he immediately sent a secret courier racing across the desert to assassinate Parmenion in Ecbatana before the old man even heard the news about his son. In one violent stroke, the entire legacy leadership was completely wiped out. Now we enter the era of Hephaestion and the new vision, focusing on the ultimate yes man and the push for Persianization. With the old guard completely gone, Alexander obviously needed a new management team aligned with his goals. Enter his childhood friend and closest confidant, Hephaestion, who stepped right into the power vacuum. He was there to champion Alexander's most controversial policy, Persianization, which was the deliberate merging of Macedonian and Persian cultures. To give Hephaestion the necessary authority, Alexander promoted him to a newly adapted role called the Chiliarch. This literally meant commander of 1,000. But here is the kicker. This was originally a Persian bodyguard office. There was absolutely no Greek equivalent for this kind of powerful, empire-wide second-in-command. To the traditionalist Macedonian soldiers, watching Hephaestion absorb this Persian title felt like watching their familiar, egalitarian leadership structure morph into a foreign, oriental tyranny. But Hephaestion wasn't just a favorite, he was an absolute force multiplier. He acted as the ultimate yes man who actually got things done. If you look at his imperial resume, it's wild. He bridged major rivers like the Euphrates and the Indus. He appointed a new king of Sidon. He managed the incredibly complex logistics of the army and built entirely new cities. He even married a Persian princess, Drapetes, to secure dynastic ties right alongside Alexander. Hephaestion essentially carried the immense burden of integrating Persian elites so that Alexander could focus entirely on warfare and conquest. Which leads us to intimidation, imperial discord, and exactly how Alexander managed dissent. As you might guess, merging these two entirely different corporate cultures, the Macedonians and the Persians, did not go smoothly. Alexander found himself managing a workforce that was increasingly exhausted, alienated, and deeply resentful of the new company direction. The absolute boiling point for this cultural clash was the introduction of proskynesis. Now, this was a Persian court etiquette requiring subjects to prostrate themselves, or bow and blow a kiss, to the great king. The Persians did this simply out of respect for rank, but the egalitarian Greeks were deeply horrified. To them, bowing like this was strictly reserved only for the gods. Alexander was essentially demanding divine submission from his employees, and they absolutely hated it. When pushback started, Alexander didn't exactly open up a healthy dialogue. He created a total culture of fear. We see a rapid succession of eliminated critics. In 328 BCE, he straight up murders his own general, Cletus the Black, during a drunken argument over these very policies. The very next year, in 327, the historian Callisthenes is executed without a trial, quickly followed by the brutal torture and killing of the royal pages. Honest counsel was completely eradicated. It was replaced by a deadly, terrifying echo chamber. The unwritten rule became very clear. To speak was to be silenced, and to be safe was to be safe. For 6 long years, the Macedonian army swallowed their anger and marched in absolute silence. The systemic intimidation worked. No one dared question the boss because questioning the boss meant a guaranteed death sentence. But, as you can imagine, psychological safety was at absolute zero, and the pressure was just building and building. And that pressure finally exploded at the mutiny at Opis in 324 BCE. Alexander announced he was sending home older Macedonian veterans and replacing them with 10,000 Persian troops trained in Macedonian tactics. For the exhausted army, this was the ultimate betrayal. They were essentially being laid off and replaced by the very people they had conquered. So they finally mutinied. Alexander's response? He ruthlessly executed the ringleaders, locked himself in his tent, and threatened to replace his entire inner circle with Persian nobles. It was a brutal, high-stakes power play, and the terrified Macedonians ultimately caved in. This dynamic required a new strategy, using rivalries as a force multiplier to divide and conquer. Managing this fractured, incredibly hostile environment required a very specific, almost manipulative type of leadership. Alexander didn't just suppress conflict, he brilliantly yet precariously weaponized the intense personal rivalries of his remaining generals to keep them productive and out of his way. The absolute best example of this is the bitter rivalry between his 2 top executives, Craterus and Hephaestion. These guys were complete character foils. Craterus was known as the lover of the king, meaning he was loyal to the traditional Macedonian state, the old ways, and the heavy infantry. Hephaestion was the lover of Alexander, loyal strictly to the man himself and the radical new Persianization vision. They represented the 2 warring ideologies within the army, and they absolutely despised each other. Alexander's genius in managing these arch-rivals came down to strict geographic separation. He essentially put them in different offices so they wouldn't kill each other. During the Indus River campaign in 326 BCE, Craterus is positioned way over on the West Bank handling traditional pacification and supplies, while Hephaestion is placed entirely on the East Bank building fortifications and cities. And Alexander? He floats right down the middle in the central fleet just to keep them apart. Even on the brutal Gedrosian return journey, Craterus takes the northern route with the veterans, while Hephaestion takes the southern desert march. Alexander deliberately kept his deadliest managers aimed at conquering vast separate territories, brilliantly using their rivalry to double his empire's footprint. But eventually the empire fragments, because the glue holding it together was incredibly fragile. You see, this entire geopolitical machine relied on one fragile glue: Alexander the Great and his trusted alter ego mediating all of this toxic friction. There were no strong institutions, there were only strong personalities. Then the unthinkable happens. In October 324 BCE, Hephaestion suddenly dies of an illness in Ecbatana. The impact is immediate and devastating. Alexander descends into a violent, completely paralyzing grief. But more than just losing his best friend, he lost the administrative core of his empire. The one man who could bridge the Macedonians and the Persians, the one man who managed the daily logistics, was just gone. The system totally shattered. The immediate collapse that followed is staggering. Strategic planning halts entirely. The Arabian expedition is completely derailed, and then just 8 months later, Alexander himself dies. The second he is gone, the toxic environment he fostered simply explodes. His successors, those surviving, heavily armed executives, instantly abandon every single one of his Persian fusion policies. Then, generals like Ptolemy take their tactical genius and turn it directly on each other, carving the empire up into heavily fortified, endlessly rival domains. Which leaves us with a lingering, provocative thought to take away from all of this. Was Alexander's true genius actually in his battlefield tactics? Or was it simply in his unique, somewhat tyrannical ability to keep his deadliest generals aimed at the enemy instead of at each other? It completely changes how we view his leadership, doesn't it? It really shows the incredibly high cost of building an empire on toxic office politics. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.